Hey everybody, welcome to Sound Bombing. I created this show for people who want to experience a radical, life-changing journey through the sounds of my diverse guests. I hope that each sound you hear on this show will strengthen your faith, encourage your dreams, and challenge you to awaken the greatness within you.
Drop the bomb. Drop the bomb. We're gonna drop the bomb. Drop the bomb. We're gonna drop the bomb. Drop the bomb. We come to drop the bomb. Drop the bomb.
This is a journey into sound. A journey which along the way will bring to you new color, new dimension, new values, and a new experience.
Ladies and gentlemen, the star of the show,
LaMarr Darnell Shields.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever the time of the day it is. You're at the right place at the right time. I am Dr. LaMarr Darnell Shields, the creator of Sound Bombing. And my goal with this show is to introduce you to people with ideas that will help you unlock your full potential. Well, we're kicking it live in 2022, and a lot of great things are happening. But we all know the feeling when you sense that you're not completely happy and fulfilled with your life. Things are not where and how you want them to be. You go through motions every day, angry with yourself and the universe for throwing you such an unfavorable dice. In this case, learning self-compassion can feel impossible. Well, listen, this past week, I facilitated a self-compassion seminar for about 200 school administrators in California. And I began by asking the participants to reflect on some of these questions. When you fail or make a mistake, what kinds of things run through your mind? Do you have a critical voice? If so, what do you find it saying to you? A good friend or trusted coworker comes to you who made a mistake. What would you say to that friend or coworker? What if you started to treat yourself like you treat a good friend or a coworker, to use the same voice with yourself? So, how would our workplace, personal life, or world be different if we were more compassionate towards ourselves? Well, these questions challenge many of those administrators to discern the meaning of self-compassion, how we extend compassion to others, and what blocks us from extending compassion to ourselves. How would you answer these questions? Well, I'm so glad that I asked you that question. I'm so glad that you're asking yourself that question, because in today's show, we're going to look into these reasons behind the feelings that we have of being unstuck, and also trying to figure out our life purpose, as well as being compassionate towards one another. Well, my next guest has over 20 years of doing this work. She's been counseling and serving as a coach. She blends elements of neuroscience, nervous system regulation, mindfulness, and psychology into her coaching practice, relying heavily on teaching emotional awareness and self-compassion coaching. I would like to welcome Kristin Taylor to the Sound Bombing community. Kristin, welcome to the show. Let my listeners know where you're calling in from, and let's just do a check-in. How are you doing today?
I am calling in from Olympia, Washington, and I am doing well today. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, as you can see, folks that are watching us, we both must be calling from cold places because we both are wearing sweaters. No, Calvin Klein is not a sponsor. It just went with my sweater. That's it. Maybe Calvin Klein will eventually be a sponsor, because I'm always wearing Calvin Klein's clothes. Kristin, thanks for hanging out with me. I'm so excited you decided to join me today. This is a great way to start the year off, because so many people create these, what do they call them? Resolution. I say let's not create resolutions. Let's create some intention. So before we get into that, why is self-compassion so important to personal and professional growth? And then how did you get on the path of self-compassion?
Okay, so 2 questions. Why is it so important? Well, there are 2 main reasons. There are far more, but I'll start with these 2. The first one is that it allows you to learn and grow and be resilient. And it keeps you well. And what I mean well, when I use the word well, I'm talking about emotionally, spiritually, and physically. So there are going to be so many times where, when we want to practice courage, we have to be self-compassionate. But when we make mistakes, which we should, if you're not practicing self-compassion, we pay a very high price. And so when I think of self-compassion, I think of it really as an act of courage, as an act of vulnerability. And there are two parts to courage as I see it. One is the part we talk about all the time, which is doing the scary thing, whatever that scary thing is for you. Like in business, it may be managing a team for the first time. It may be giving a public presentation. And that is the, like, I'm going to be courageous. I'm going to get in front of people. It's relational. That's the vulnerability with other people. But what I feel like is less spoken about and given attention to and is highly neglected is the second part. It's like act 2 of courage is how we behold ourselves. And this is where self-compassion needs to show up in order for us to learn and grow and practice courage. And so when I say that is, let's say you've had a job interview, let's say you've given a presentation, let's say you've done anything that took courage relationally, and you didn't do it perfectly. How do you care for yourself? Do you beat yourself up? Do you criticize yourself? Or do you say, yes, the mistake was made, and I'm going to show up with love. I'm going to be my own ally. I'm going to dust myself off. I'm going to acknowledge myself for at least trying. It is that space that I feel like we don't spend enough time saying, well, if you are going to show up in this amazing, challenging, difficult world and try to make a difference or try to be yourself or try to do whatever is aligned with your values in this precious time on earth, in order to show up, you need to practice self-compassion for the resilience. And I know for myself, so the second part of your question, I believe, was,
when did you start this journey? Yeah. Out of all the things you could have been doing, I read your bio, I read many things about all the things that Kristin could have been doing. How did you get on the path of self-compassion?
Because I was so damn hard on myself. I am a highly sensitive person. I am an empath. I read situations. I am an introvert. And so I'm constantly processing all of this stimulation and input, and it can get locked in. And I felt like even from being a child, I didn't move through the world as easily. Things would get to me more. And then I would judge myself. And I would always be judging things on the outside by my insides. So people looked like they were just like moving and grooving through the world, and it wasn't as hard as it was. And I'm sure it was. But internally, I thought, well, that doesn't even resemble my internal experience of being overstimulated in terms of my nervous system. And so instead of really regarding that with kindness and care and insight, I was too young. I would beat myself up. What's wrong with me? I am broken. There's something wrong. And the world reinforced it. My family life reinforced it. And that became my belief system. And so I was always drawn to both spirituality and psychology and wanting to understand things. And so it was over really the last 30 years that I have, especially in the last 5, come to recognize like the spiritual journey has to include self-compassion in a way that I was so just like piling on the ways that I was broken and not enough. And it was making me sick. I now struggle with autoimmunity, and I know in part it is because I didn't value and honor who I am, how I move through the world, my story. And I hadn't cultivated what self-care means. It's just this like self-care, have a bubble bath, have a cup of tea. It is so much more important than that. The word guilt is really important. So much, and I really get this from the work of Kristin Neff, and she's really the thought leader in self-compassion. And there are 2 things to what you're saying that stand out to me. One, I'll talk about women, but it's not strictly women, but typically speaking, we can say predominantly it might be women. One is this idea around self-worth. This idea that in order to be loved or lovable, I need to pour into other people because then I get love. And it's always putting other people first is a sense of I'm going to manage this guilt by always kind of keeping a scorecard. Like if I'm doing all of these things, then I don't have to feel guilty because I can rationalize and say, see, I did those things. I'm not a bad person. I'm not selfish. I think it's such a fear that self-compassion is selfishness, when in fact, it is quite the opposite. We always talk about the metaphor we get on a plane. It's like put your own oxygen mask on first before you try to teach someone else how to breathe. We need to know how to breathe. And in fact, when we care for ourselves, we can be the best mother, aunt, friend, whomever. We need to care for ourselves. But then what I know also happens is that when people think about self-compassion, they think, well, I'm just going to be a baby then. Am I just going to be in the corner licking my wounds and, oh, it's okay, and you don't have to try? That my motivation will suddenly be hampered and diminished, that I will no longer be accountable or responsible if I'm continually self-compassionate. Well, studies have shown quite the opposite. And this gets back to what I was talking about, emotional resilience, about fortitude, perseverance, in a sustainable way where we're not making ourselves sick. If you do something and you make a mistake, and I hope people are making lots of mistakes because that's where we learn, it's in those places that we can pause and reassess, be kind to ourselves, see ourselves clearly, not excuse bad behavior, but understand, where is this coming from? What do I need? How do I move forward? How do I take responsibility? How do I be my own best friend versus my own enemy so that I can continue moving forward? It's increasing motivation because it's about integrity.
So then what makes self-compassion so challenging for so many people? Yeah.
Well, for those two reasons, once they feel like it's an easy way out, they're going to let themselves off the hook. And they have an identity that is connected to, I'm a hard worker, I pour into people, I'm a giver. And so if I'm not continuing in those behaviors, who am I? So it's changing a habit, which is highly uncomfortable. And people don't like to be uncomfortable. We covet what is familiar, right? And so when it's saying, try to engage with yourself first and then the world secondly, differently, it might be really good for them, but it's uncomfortable. It's unfamiliar. It might be the healthiest thing to do, but that sense of discomfort then leads into, well, then let's look at that discomfort and let's take a look at those emotions. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes teaching emotional regulation. So if they're saying, I'm going to set a boundary and I'm going to finish work today at 6:00 and I'm going to make a nice dinner for myself, a healthy dinner for myself. And then suddenly they're like, oh gosh, I see someone texted me and needs me, or I could be doing something for someone else. And it's the emotional regulation piece because guilt might come up. Judgment might come up. And that is the place that I work with people. So we do mindfulness practices to say, well, one of the first steps, rather than reactively saying, oh, guilt and judgment are so uncomfortable, I'm just going to pick up my phone, forget the dinner, I'm racing over and helping someone else. It's saying, sit with those feelings. The first thing, and there was a study out of UCLA, and it's called affect labeling. Simply assigning a name to a feeling is such a pivotal step in processing emotion.
What does that do? What does that do for an individual? Once you name an emotion that's coming up, let's just say during your practice, a lot of times during the meditation practice, these emotions come up, these thoughts come up, these fantasies come up, these stories come up. What would you say is the benefit of actually giving it a name?
Well, the benefit of giving it a name is that it's acknowledging what is. Two of the main ways that we suffer and get stuck is we either over-identify with our feelings. Guilt is some sort of indication about my identity that something is wrong or broken, or we push them down or push them away. And when we push feelings and emotions down or away, it creates amplification. They actually just get bigger. The idea of what we resist persists. So it's important just to say, this is happening right now. And really mindfulness is saying, what is my mind full of? And it's showing up with a neutral curiosity. It's not identification with, you are not your feelings, but to say guilt is surfacing. I'm going to name it. I'm going to allow it to be here. It's like leaves in a breeze, waves in the ocean. Like, it's not who you are. They're not temporary, they're not permanently here. But they're going to stay longer if you don't pause and say, oh, it's happening. Guilt is here. Judgment is here. Shame is here. So that's what it gives you. And it allows us to have emotions move through us versus the body kind of restricting and causing dis-ease. So it's so important.
You know, I'm so glad that you talked about mindfulness, because in my work, I've shared with, for-profit leaders, nonprofit leaders, one component of self-compassion is mindfulness, and being mindful reduces ruminating on negative thoughts. So to go a little deeper than this, how are mindfulness, self-compassion, and empathy related to emotional regulation? And then what impact do they have, let's just say, on a team culture and achieving results? And as you're thinking about that, I want to share of how I approach our work. My partner, Dr. Gilmore, and I, we do a lot of work around equity, diversity, inclusion. And so what's interesting is people are so amazed that when our first session is always about mindfulness, how to be a mindful leader. We don't even define what equity is. We don't even get into that until maybe session number 4. And so before, we used to jump right into the definition of equity. But what we've discovered from the people who we're engaging, they want us to slow it down. Many of them are new to this. And when we are mindful of our struggles and respond to ourselves with compassion and kindness, we know it helps things come a much better. But, how are you using that when it comes to bringing together teams and cultures of achieving definitely similar results? Because you can do it as an individual, but then when you come to as a collective, then it can be somewhat challenging.
Very challenging. So the term that comes to mind in relationship to why mindfulness is so important in terms of working as a team is creating psychological safety. And psychological safety means that people feel safe enough to say what can be uncomfortable. They can have a dissenting opinion. They can ask a question that perhaps they feel they should know the answer to. They can contribute in a way where even if they say something that they're like, oh God, I wish I didn't say that, they know that the team holds them in high regard, and that there is emotional safety, that there is an openness and a vulnerability, so that there is trust. Psychological safety is about trust, but you can only engage a team and move towards psychological safety when there's a level of self-awareness that each participant invests in and develops and possesses. And so what mindfulness does is that it elevates self-awareness, because we're not caught in coping strategies and coping mechanisms and defense mechanisms that keep us trapped in habituated ways that are probably adaptive in many ways throughout our life, but destructive. Because if people show up and they don't know who they are, and they are acting in ways that are defending their own ego but harming other people, you're not going to achieve a collective goal when they're looking at their own needs, sometimes primitive, sometimes egoic, sometimes based in fear, and all of those are kind of one and the same. And so mindfulness allows people to say, okay, here we are coming as a team. And what we know is the greatest foundation that we need to establish is trust, so that we can create an environment of psychological safety, so that we can speak our truth and collectively move towards an outcome we are hoping to achieve, impact we want to make. We all need to come together through the wholeness of who we are. So what that requires is I know who I am, and that if something comes up for me, I can raise my hand and say, I'm not comfortable with that. Or can we move this other way? Or I have a question, or I have a brilliant idea that might shift the paradigm, but I feel safe enough to share it. And that starts with saying, what are my habits of thought? What are my beliefs? How do I emotionally regulate in the moment and understand how I process thoughts, feelings, and beliefs, so that I can ultimately be accountable to myself and the goal of the team.
So you mentioned the word trust on several occasions, and a lot of the work I do is centered around relational trust. So, but my question as it relates to trust when we're working with teams, how do you then rebuild trust once it's been broken within a team and or an organization?
Mm-hmm. It's about repairing and restoring. So this is the psychological safety. So when I imagine sitting down with a team, it's creating a very strong framework for a conversation and creating safety through strong facilitation. and getting buy-in to say, let's remember big picture. Why are we here? And it's so interesting when you actually, and I ask this all the time of people who are in different roles, why do you do what you do? It can take a really long time for them to get to why they do what they do. And if there is enough unity around why are we here, then they remember, okay, this is why not only I show up to work, but why I'm in a relationship with these people. It's because we want to achieve this goal. And then it is the psychological safety to say, we're going to have hard conversations. We're going to speak from a place of vulnerability and courage, and we're going to take ownership. And so you need to be able to call out, this is where the rupture was. This is what happened. I mean, this is such a big question because there's so many aspects to it. Because then there is active listening. Then there is empathy. And man, oh man, I've given so many trainings on empathy. And it's a word that we, bandy about all the time. But when you actually say, okay, empathy, I'm going to share with you. I felt really tired this morning. Say something that is an empathetic statement. What I normally hear is encouragement. I don't hear empathy. And so there's a lot to unpack and unravel there and teach and train to say empathy is feeling, thinking with someone. It's not fixing it. It's not being a cheerleader, but it's teaching these emotional skills so that people know how to be in relationship with one another so that they can repair and restore. And there should be rifts. If you're really moving towards something that is so meaningful, we're human beings. There are going to be times where there are misunderstandings. There are going to be times when we're not all on the same page or see something the same way. But can we shed light on that while maintaining the respect for one another?
So I see in many organizations, we talk about, and you mentioned this as well, building relationships with one another. But I think one of the challenges that most of us have is we don't build a relationship with ourselves. So what I've discovered, and I'm sure you would agree, it seems easier to be nice to others than to be ourselves. And so then how do we then help individuals turn on themselves? I remember someone sharing a story about a woman who had just gotten divorced and she went out on a date. So her friend comes over, she gets dressed up and she's like, girl, you're going on a date. I'm happy. She gets dressed up. She goes out there. She goes to the date. She goes on a date. The date is over in 5 minutes. She comes back and she tells her friend, it was a horrible date. He did this, that, the other. And the friend says, yeah, you're right. I wouldn't have worn that dress. I wouldn't have said those things. I wouldn't have done those things. And everything the guy said to you, I agree with. Then someone turned to me and said, well, what if I tell you that the guy didn't say that or the best friend didn't say that, but the person who went on the date said it to herself? And so as we talk about relationships with one another, it's easier that I've discovered for people to be nicer, to speak truth to power to others. But help my listeners come up with some ways where they can support themselves when they're feeling down and when some of the sentence stems, that's my teaching in me, some of the sentence stems that they can then use to then engage themselves while they're motivating themselves. Because a lot of times we can motivate and inspire other folks, but we don't have the same conversation with ourselves.
100%. And so there's so many ways to go about this, but I want to stay consistent in today's episode so that your listeners are hearing me say the same things over and over again. So when they walk away, they can go, okay, she said that. So number one is pushing the pause button. So you're talking about being in relationship with self. If we're going to have true, authentic connection, we have to be truly, authentically connected to ourselves. Practicing self-compassion. Practicing self-compassion. And so it's important to push the pause button when we are caught in constellations of feelings, thoughts, and beliefs that make us uncomfortable or activate us, right? And so many examples. I'm going to share one. I've been married for a very long time, and my husband and I have routines, and we know each other's buttons. And I know my own past really well enough to understand in my upbringing, it was not safe for me to express my anger. It wasn't. So what that meant is growing up, I've established, and I take ownership and working on it, I can be passive aggressive. And so there was one morning where he and I were in something and I felt angry. And what did I do? I got snide and I was passive aggressive. And he said, Kristin, I'm not going to do this with you today. And he walked away. And I pulled myself aside because I felt this bitterness, this snarkiness. My ego was going into defense. It was all his fault. But because I've been practicing mindfulness for so long, it was this like metacognition, this other part of myself that was watching my own habits of thought. And I pushed the pause button and I breathed. Because what was happening, I was getting caught in my amygdala. I was getting caught in the limbic system, the most primitive emotional center of our brains that get us into fight or flight or freeze, and that get us out of our prefrontal cortex where we can think globally, where we can take accountability. I was just like, it's his fault. He's hurting me. I'm going to be snide. But I saw like, okay, even when it was happening, I see that this is happening. I'm going to pull myself aside. I'm going to sit down. And I said out loud, it's happening. And what I meant was I was getting caught in the spell of my own upbringing and habits of maladaptive functioning, right? And I said out loud, it's happening. And then I breathed so that I could soothe my nervous system and so that I could get to executive functioning and start to practice compassion. And then I said out loud to myself, Kristin, this is the place that is so hard for you. And that was compassion. That was, like I said, breaking the spell. And if I didn't have that awareness, think of what that would do to my relationship with myself. I would be caught in ego and defensiveness, but also abandoning my own vulnerability. Why was I angry with my husband? Maybe because I felt, and I don't even remember, but maybe I felt unseen or unappreciated. But none of that would have been tapped into. I had to pause and go, I'm getting caught in this sort of maelstrom of the storm of wanting to be reactive and wanting to defend. And I had to say, it's happening. And then breathe and then show compassion.
Well, I love your transparency and being very authentic, because quite often when I bring people onto this show, I want folks to see the human side of us who are called to do this work. The individuals who are writing, who are lecturing, who are teaching, who are coaching. And quite often, many of those people, not on this show, because I pull it out, many of those people don't want to share those parts of them. And I think in order for us to engage with our audience, it's very important to be, as Brene Brown, who's the vulnerability guru, it's very important for us to get to that level. So I want to go back with that story, because there's somebody that's listening right now. And they're like, yeah, Kristin, but you've been doing the work on yourself. Yeah, you've been reading and writing about this. But talk to that person who is not new to many of the vocabulary terms or many of the modalities that you mentioned. When they're in that moment, what are some things that they can do to then get back on the path of self-compassion? When they're in that moment, what are some things that they can say to themselves right now when they're stressed out? When they're in that moment, what are some things that they're feeling when they're stressed, and how can they own those things?
Yeah, I agree with 100% with everything that you just said. I keep saying there are two parts, but it feels like there are always two parts. If they're new to it, they may not be able to as quickly do what I did, because I've been practicing this for so long, to in the moment recognize I'm in my own BS. I'm in my own defended ego place. But it's upon reflection. Maybe it's the next day. Maybe it's that evening where you realized, let's say in a conversation with a coworker, with a friend, with a partner, that you weren't showing up as your best self, right? That is an opportunity to show up. And I know it's about teaching in a way where they can start to implement it. And that's really what I'm aiming for, as I'm thinking through this. I feel like the most fundamental thing we can do when we're looking at our own behavior and the places where we feel like we're falling short is to start with breath work, because it interrupts habits of thinking and gets us more embodied. It soothes the nervous system and it keeps us out of that, what's called an amygdala hijack. And that hijack is what keeps us caught in the illusion that there's not enough love, there's not enough money, there's not enough time, we are alone, based in fear. And so simply breathing, and there's one breathing exercise that I think is so easy and accessible, because you can feel like there's a million, and what do you mean breathe? I breathe all day long. Mm-hmm. There's a way of breathing where we can engage the autonomic nervous system to get us grounded and calm.
How about you take our listeners through their breathing? Because my thing is, I tell people I can show you better than I can tell you. So how about you just take them through this process?
Perfect. So before I take them through the process, I want to explain a little bit about the functioning of the autonomic nervous system so they understand what is happening and why it matters. So there are two branches to the nervous system. There's the sympathetic, and that is upregulating. That's giving us energy. You're, a gazelle on the Serengeti and you're being chased by a cheetah. That is like, you want to be in sympathetic activation. All the blood is going to the extremities so that you can run like hell and stay alive. Then there is parasympathetic, and that is down regulating. That's like a moving car. You're pumping the brakes, slowing it down. That is rest and digest. That is where we feel calm. It's home base. We feel connected and present. And so if you're moving through your day, so many of us, can get caught in overactivation. We're upregulated. And if you're thinking, I'm not thinking clearly, or I want to reflect on a place where I kind of put my foot in my mouth, or I hurt someone's feelings, or I felt like my feelings were hurt, and I wanted to just reflect in an honest, compassionate way with myself, start by breathing in a way that activates the parasympathetic and down regulates. So when we inhale, our sympathetic nervous system is activated. Our blood pressure goes up and our heart rate goes up. That is upregulating. When we exhale, we are engaging the parasympathetic, which is rest and digest. Our blood pressure and our heart rate goes down. And so there's a breathing technique called ratio breathing. And what it means is that when you're breathing, inhaling through your nose and then exhaling through your mouth, you are breathing in for a shorter period of time, sympathetic activation, and exhaling for a longer period of time, parasympathetic. So it might look like, you breathe through your nose for a count of, and there's no magic number, you tune into your own body, say a count of 4. And then you exhale for a count of 8, 10, 12, whatever your body needs. But when you are exhaling, I imagine it like when you're swimming and you're pushing your arms and your legs against the water, there's tension. So it's not just, it's, and you're really extending that out breath so that you're engaging the parasympathetic and getting to that rest and digest present moment. And then you can say to yourself, I'm going to practice self-compassion. And here's something else that I want to share. So let's say you are reflecting on perhaps feeling guilt. A slippery slope question when we're reflecting on a moment when we are feeling guilty is to say, why am I feeling guilty? It's an important question, but sometimes we stay there too long and we get caught in the old story.
The narrative, yeah.
The narrative.
And that can be somewhat a judgmental question. We talk about trauma-informed care, not what's wrong with you, what happened to you. And I think helping individuals to ask different questions of themselves are very, very important, because quite often some of those questions can be judgmental. Then, because if someone else asks you that question, then you're ready to attack. But then when you ask yourself the same question, actually, you're also attacking yourself. I think asking questions have a lot of value when it comes to compassion, when it comes to understanding who you are.
Exactly. I love that so much. And so here is a question I invite people to ask Instead of saying, why am I doing this? Why is this happening? To say, what do I need? What does this tender place need? What does this feeling need? And I ask people just to tune into their body. Let's say when guilt comes up, they feel it in their throat or they feel it in their heart. What does it need? Maybe it needs understanding. Maybe it needs a hug. Maybe it needs a spiritual connection, whatever that belief system is, to come in with wisdom, right? It really shifts. And that can be a really hard question to answer. So sit on it. In those places of vulnerability or feeling caught, feeling, really trapped with this compulsion to continually give of yourself when you are empty. When I feel guilty, what does this need to be soothed? And I love using that word. How can I soothe the discomfort of this? And again, breathe.
I love that. So I heard everything that you're saying, and I'm actually in the mind of my listener. I heard everything that you said, Kristin. I love your passion for this message. Thank you for your transparency and being authentic about sort of where you are and how you started your journey. But my question is, how do I get started? What are some of the first steps that I need to take to start feeling, one is maybe good about myself, start owning where I am, and really to be compassionate towards myself and my thoughts?
Mm-hmm. Well, the fact that someone would even say, how can I start, is so hugely significant. So honoring, like, I want to change, is the first step in changing. Recognizing that there is a problem is hugely both courageous and the step forward. So honor that. Like, I recognize I don't want to do this way anymore. Number one. I'll say it again. Number two, practice breathing. Just practice breathing so that when you get caught, you can start to interrupt it. And then start reading books. I would encourage people to just go online and Google Kristin Neff, Neff, and her first name is also spelled like mine, Kristin, right? Those are 3 significant ways where you can start to learn what is self-compassion and how can I start to practice it. And then there's so many of us. I would love if someone wanted to have a conversation, have a discovery call about, I know that I need to make a difference. Email me. Let's meet for however long you have to explore where you are now and where you want to be and why it matters to you. Because change is possible, and it doesn't need to be this like, I'm going to go on a retreat, I'm going to totally change my life. It can start by, I'm going to be mindful when I make my bed. I'm going to breathe differently in the morning. It starts with small steps.
Well, I know there's been an explosion of research into self-compassion over the last decade, and there's a lot of research around some of the benefits of its well-being. Talk to me about some of the benefits of self-compassion.
Well, this is where I don't have them in front of me, but I've read the studies. Reduced depression, reduced anxiety, reduced stress, reduced high blood pressure, better relationships with other people, better communication, higher emotional intelligence, greater emotional resilience, less, I think I'd have to look it up, but if memory serves, lower, cardiac issues. It has such a profound impact on our well-being and our health.
I know you're a podcaster. Let my listeners know the name of your podcast. Who are some of the people that you brought on? And then why did you decide to start a podcast?
Yes. So the name of the podcast, thank you, is called How I Made It Through. And it's stories of people who've gone through challenges or adversity, and they learned and were transformed by them. And they have wise lessons, sagacious stories that all of us can learn from, sort of as this survival guide of resilience and wisdom. And I did it because as a coach, I hear these stories every day. And I feel like between now and the time I die, I want more of these stories shared to transform and inspire other people in their own healing journeys.
Well, see, you and I have that in common. I do a live storytelling series called The Shortcut Show. It's a stage performance We specifically work with people of color because I feel like our stories aren't out there enough. And so it's a stage performance and I get a chance to meet people all over the country. Now we got to share, we got to share some things. Tell me one of the story without telling me the whole story. Is there any story from one of your guests that you had on that was just so compelling that just literally blew you away?
Yeah, there is a woman by the name of Mara Levy, and she is a medical miracle. There's an article written on her being a medical miracle, and she was at UCSF. She had a congenital heart defect. And in the course of about 7 days, no, it was more than that. I can't remember the amount of days right now, but she had 3 open heart surgeries and was in a coma. And she had this spiritually transformative experience. And it just opened her heart to compassion in a way that completely changed everything for her. And so she shares being on the other side when she encounters people who come across as aggressive, egregious, difficult. She immediately shows up with compassion and empathy, and she shares stories of how that transforms the conversation. And I feel like right now, in a time of, such radical polarization, those are the stories we can learn from. That it unites our humanity. She is amazing. Her ability to be present. I mean, she could have walked away with an anxiety disorder, with absolute despair, and how she connected to love. I will never forget.
Well, I want my listeners to go and check out your podcast. We both understand the power of story, the power of narrative. And I really, really appreciate that. Doctor, I think it was Dr. Wayne Dyer said, he talks about changing your story, changing your mindset, things will all change. And if you change the way you look at the things that you look at typically change. So I think those stories are very transformative. So thank you for sharing. How can my listeners get in contact with you if they want to work with you, if they want to read more information about the great things that you're doing, if they want to follow you on all social media platforms? What's the best way to get in contact with you?
There are, once again, 2 ways. One is emailing me at Coach Kristin, Kristin, Taylor @gmail.com, or my website is KristinTaylorConsulting.com. Those are the 2 best ways, and they can learn a little bit more about me with my website.
Cannot leave just yet. The second part of the show is called the Super Bomb Questions. And these questions are somewhat different, Kristin. The response needs to be swift and quick, which is basically the same thing. And I did not see these questions ahead of time for that reason. So are you ready for the Super Bomb question? All right, so here we go. What's your favorite word?
Judge.
What's your favorite quote?
Every action in this world has its echo in the heart.
What's your superpower?
Kindness.
What's your spirit animal?
Elephant.
What moves you to tears of joy?
Nature.
What moves you to tears of sorrow?
Nature.
What do you wish you had more time to do?
Sing, dance, laugh.
What advice are you glad you ignored?
To be more outgoing.
What's a ritual you do that helps you connect to your inner power?
Breathing.
What do you know for sure?
We are far more connected and united than we live as if we are not.
Final question, Kristin Taylor. If you were in the Mrs. America talent competition, what would your talent be?
It would be imitating voices and celebrities.
You can do that?
There are certain people, what I always say, I wish my mother was famous because I just nail her. Yeah, I'm really good at imitating voices and accents. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, I appreciate your energy. I appreciate your drive. I appreciate you being courageous and just being very authentic and sharing all of you with my listeners. It's been a pleasure hanging out with you today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yes. And yes, I appreciate you too. And to all of my listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. Listen, if you want to know more about me, go to drdrlds.com. Stop being stingy. Share me with all of your friends. We're on every social media platform out there. There's no reason not to reach out to us. But bigger than that, make sure you subscribe. But greater than that, listen, go out and do something for someone other than yourself today. You've been listening to Sound Bombing. Peace.
You were so good at this. It's just,
Oh,
it's such a thrill to watch you and be part of this.